Dear audience, welcome to the International Science Festival Gothenburg and this inauguration. With hundreds of activities and about 60,000 visits yearly, the festival is one of Europe's leading popular science events and the only one of its kind in Sweden. Our mission is to bring science to the public while giving the research community a meeting place. Tonight we open the 24th festival, and all through the weekend you can take part in our exciting program, from quiz with a science twist to deep conversations on what we are, and you can listen to lectures on anything from COVID-19 to space and all there is between. This year, the Science Festival is almost entirely digital. It is a real festival in the virtual world. As always, it is free of charge and open to everyone. The theme of the 2020 International Science Festival is movement. Humanity is on the move. We challenge physical boundaries. We move farther and farther into space. We merge with technology and invent new versions of ourselves. We join movements and fight for our rights. Before we start this evening's program, I would like to hand over to the organizers. First of all, Carl-Johan Sundberg.
Thank you. This year's theme, movement, has been the focus of scientific studies since science began over 2,000 years ago. In the beginning, planetary movements, or the movement of water and the weather systems and so, was studied as phenomena. Later, biological movement came into the picture because every living being has some form of movement, either can move itself or move things internally. My own field of study is also movement, but is more about movement for health, namely exercise. Science has been, for a long time, the best way to understand the world. And that understanding leads to many solutions of problems that we have. The fact that we can sit here today and interact, even though we're not in the same place, is thanks to fundamental discoveries of science and further technology development. Also, I think science should be looked as one of the key issues or key methods to have a fact-based world, which is very important for democracy, something that is discussed heavily today. Thus, science has been an immensely important tool to solve the problems and needs of the past, and will continue to do so in the future. That's my firm belief. With that, I hand over to Sven Stafström.
Hello, I'm Sven Stafström, Director General of the Swedish Research Council. I would like to begin by stressing how important it is to spread knowledge about science. Why? Because we need science, and science affects all of us in one way or the other. We need science to understand complex phenomena, and we need science to develop our society in a sustainable way. There are different ways to communicate scientific results. I think that a science festival represents something unique in this respect. The two words, science and festival, signal both importance and joy, a nice combination indeed. And I would like to add that the Science Festival in Göteborg is also well known for its creativity and sort of unexpected ways to work with science communication. The Swedish Research Council is proud to contribute to this 24th Science Festival. This time the festival is held in an unusual format, but thanks to research and innovation, we have the digital tools that enable meetings like this. And also thanks to all the dedicated people involved. The program, I think, is as interesting as ever before. Great work. So I would like to wish you a fantastic science festival. Thank you.
My name is Jenny Turner, and I'm the manager of the Science Festival. Even if this year has been like no other, there will still, of course, be a science festival. And my team has worked incredibly hard to make this happen. But as Winston Churchill once said, never let a good crisis go to waste. So with that, I would like to say thank you all for joining us tonight and doing this together with us. Jan-Erik.
Thank you very much, Jenny. As has been said before by the other speakers, science is extremely important and has probably never been as important as it is right now. Science and science facts brought out to a broader audience is crucial. And that has been the theme of the Science Festival for now the 24th time. As also been said, this is slightly different today with the Science Festival being brought out completely digital. And there are many that have worked really hard and contributed to the Science Festival this year as well as previous years. First of all, Jenny and her team has worked immensely hard to create this as good as it was before and in the different format of being broadcasted virtually on the net. Also, the partners, out of which we have seen one, the Science Research Council of Sweden, has contributed greatly over long times to sort of make this festival what it is today and what it has been over the years. Also, we have a lot of good friends. In fact, we use the philosophy that John Lennon and Paul McCartney taught us in 1967. We get along with a little help from our friends. And I would like to thank our friends, the sponsors of this festival, without the festival wouldn't have happened at all. And there are so many that have sponsored this, old friends and new friends. And this inauguration wouldn't have happened if we haven't had support from the Sten Allan Olsson Foundation for Culture and Research. And with that, I would like to officially open the Science Festival, the International Science Festival Gothenburg 2020. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, movement is this year's theme, and I would say that a certain type of movement is growth and scaling up. Someone who has spent years looking closely at this is Geoffrey West, physicist, distinguished professor and former president of the Santa Fe Institute, the world's leading research center for complex systems science. Professor West went from particle physics to studying biological systems, fascinated in the symmetry that he saw when biological creatures scaled up. Were there similar scaling effects in social systems, such as cities and companies? He decided to study that too, and one of the results is the book Scale. We are tremendously pleased to introduce to you today, live from Los Angeles, Professor Geoffrey West. Welcome.
Hello. Hey, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I'm absolutely delighted to be involved. I'm just incredibly disappointed that I can't be there in person. I was so excited about coming originally, and very much look forward to it. And well, you all know what's happened. And so what I'm going to do this evening is to present you with a sort of big picture view of thinking about some of the problems and issues we face on the planet, and leading into ideas about long-term sustainability and what that might involve. And I'm going to present a kind of alternative lens, sort of a complementary lens for thinking about some of these issues. And I'm going to bring up a bunch of slides, if you bear with me a moment. I don't know, hopefully, can everybody see that? Is that available, hopefully? This big picture view I'm going to introduce by showing you an imaginary picture of what I perceive a photograph of the planet at night would have looked like, taken by a NASA satellite in the year I was born, which is 1940. There it is. And compare it to what it looks like today, which is this. And there you see it, not surprisingly maybe. In that short period of time, the Earth has just glowed. I mean, it's almost on fire. And of course, you know what that represents. It's, of course, a reflection of population growth, huge increase, exponential increase in socioeconomic activity, and for the purposes of this talk, the urbanization of the planet. And that's what you're seeing there. And just to give you a sense of the scale of that, if we just continue with this, which is inevitable in the near future, then you average to the mid-century, this is equivalent to urbanizing well over 1 million people, something like 1.5 million people every week, which is equivalent to adding an entire New York metropolitan area every few months, or a Göteborg every few days, which is truly extraordinary. It's been going on, it's going on right now, and it will continue to go on, and its impact, which has already been enormous, is going to be even more so. And the question is, how do we understand it and how do we deal with it? But the lesson I took from this is that to understand the future of the planet, we need to also understand cities, because they're going to play a central role. So with that in mind, I and other colleagues have tried to develop what, for a better phrase, has become known as the science of cities. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about that in some of the talk. So when you think of city, this is sort of the image that sort of automatically conjures up in one's mind, the buildings, the roads, the general infrastructure. But what I want to focus on is what all this is actually for. And that, of course, is for people. And in fact, it's in order to create social interactions, create social networks, in order to encourage entrepreneurship, wealth creation, more knowledge, ideas, innovation, and so forth, the very essence of life, of social life. And a great city provides not only formal venues for doing this, such as one you're in, but informal ones, such as this, where people can gather and interchange ideas, most of which are not of interest, probably not of interest to anyone. But occasionally this process, what is represented here, produces the theory of relativity, or a Microsoft, or an Amazon, or a Volvo, whatever. But that process is inherent in what a city is, bringing people together. So the city can be thought of as this extraordinary machine that has evolved to create wealth, knowledge, innovation, and ideas, thereby increasing standards of quality of life. And in many ways, it's been extraordinarily successful, but it has come at a huge cost. And that cost, I like to paraphrase, in the term social entropy, borrowing from the second law of thermodynamics, and you're all familiar with this. All these kinds of things that we associate with modern urban life across the globe, and we encapsulate in the questions and problems and challenges of pollution, climate change, crime, inequality, disease, pandemics, and social unrest. And lest you think that these two slides I added in the last couple of months because what's been happening, no, I've actually included exactly these two slides in talks for the last 10 years, because the dynamic that gives us this great quality of life also has in it the potential to create disease, pandemics, and indeed social unrest, sadly, some of which we have seen. So the conventional way of dealing with our problems, with understanding cities, with administering them and so on, is to put boxes around all the various pieces, deconstruct it into its components, and this is some arbitrary list, but we usually go much further than this. We deconstruct the boxes into other boxes, and within those boxes we make other boxes, and we go down to its component parts, thereby looking generically at short timescales and over short distances, local problems being solved rather than big problems. And that has also worked to some extent, but of course it neglects an essential feature of cities and any complex system, and that is, of course, that all these things are interrelated. You change one, you affect the others. So each one of these is of itself an evolving complex adaptive system, and this interacting with all the others, and the whole, the city in this case, is in fact a sum of all these interrelated complex adaptive systems. Given this, it is not surprising that we have lots of unintended consequences, and that's been the history of cities and urban planning and many other things. And in particular, we should not have been surprised that a random fluctuation of a mutation of a rare virus in a far-off city in China results in no football, shortage of yeast and flour, social unrest, bankruptcy of Hertz rental car, and millions of other things at different places across the globe within a very short period of time. Even though these all seemingly are uninterrelated before we looked at COVID, they are in fact and still are highly interrelated. And this, of course, is the mother, I consider the mother of all butterfly effects. It all happened in exponential time. So from the pictures I've showed you, the images, I conceive of a city as sort of the integration and of two pieces. One of its physicality, its energy, resources, infrastructure, so to speak, its metabolism, strongly coupled to the social networks, exchanging information, which is what ultimately will create knowledge, wealth, and so forth. And all of this happens through networks. So networks play a fundamental role, and you're very familiar with the kind of physical networks, road transport networks and electrical lines and gas lines and so forth. Here's a nice map of the United States showing the volume of truck traffic into Laredo, Texas, I arbitrarily chose. And what you see is a lovely network. And of course, you immediately recognize it as looking just like what's going on inside you. And indeed, it's quite similar to what goes on inside you. It's quite similar to your cardiovascular system. And indeed, all of biology functions by flows of energy and information through networks, including your very brain. And one of the remarkable things about this point of view is that this can be mathematized. This can be put into mathematics. Networks obey mathematical laws. And by using those mathematical laws and imposing on them something, a very strong assumption coming out of natural selection, that natural selection, the survival of the fittest, the implicit competition, has led to a tend towards optimization. This leads to some extraordinary predictions, and I'm just going to show you a couple very quickly. This is what this is on the horizontal axis is the size of an animal. on the vertical axis, the metabolic rate. And what you see here, the prediction is that that should just be a straight line when you plot this data and logarithmically, meaning that you go up by factors of 10, as you can see looking at those axes. And what you see here is these animals, all of which evolved by natural selection from random kinds of phenomena that happened in their evolutionary history, somehow have lined up on this one line, constrained by those networks. And so it's sort of the opposite view of what we think about natural selection as giving rise to random points all over the graph. No, they line up in a very regular fashion following a very simple rule. And the slope of that line, by the way, is approximately 3/4. That's called sublinear. And that sublinearity reflects something that is called an economy of scale, because what it implies is that the same gram of tissue requires less energy the bigger you are in a systematic, predictable way. And it's so, and you can take this network idea and it constrains all of the physiology and life history of these animals. So you give me the size of a mammal, say, I can tell you pretty much everything about its physiology and life history to about 80–90%. So one of the consequences of this is to take this idea, this network idea, and the resulting scaling laws and ask, how do things grow? Well, I'm going to come back to this shortly about cities, but suffice it to say, you put that into mathematics and you get this kind of result. Namely, you get very good prediction of the growth here of a rat. And what you see, and this is the important point here, is the sublinear scaling. The economy of scale leads to the fact that these animals, we stop growing. And that's a crucial part of the sustainability of life on the planet, that we lead to a stable configuration. Now, the question is, given what I've shown you, can these sort of hidden laws of biology translate into hidden laws of cities? Are there similar things? We saw there were these network structures. And if we take those kinds of ideas, it turns out the answer is yes. And here's data on something quite mundane, petrol stations in Europe, 4 different countries. And what you see is good evidence of scaling. And you see it's quite similar to biology. In fact, it expresses an economy of scale. The bigger the city, the less gas stations per capita are needed in a systematic, predictable way. But what's amazing about this is true across the world with the same economy of scale. The slope of that graph is approximately 0.85 rather than 0.75 of biology. Otherwise, it's quite similar. But it's true of all infrastructure, whether it's here, gas stations, roads, electrical lines, buildings, and so on. And so in that sense, a city is biological, but in a very deep sense, it is not biological. It is something beyond biological. And that's the most interesting part of the city, namely us, because that's why cities are here, of course, and that is social networks, also, of course, networks. And these networks have a very different character. They are modular. That is, we have families and groups and divisions and departments on the one hand, and on the other, we have to be in some place. We have to be tied to the ground in some way or another. And that is the interface between what I said earlier, the physicality and the informational. And it's expressed here in this little cartoon. And that, of course, is reflected in these images that I showed you earlier. But the other thing that is different about these networks, social networks, is represented in this picture in the middle, that A is talking to B, talks to C, talks to D. But that builds, they each build on each other. We build on each other in a very short periods of time. And that leads to positive feedback, as I say, ultimately in very special cases, leading to quantum mechanics or Google. That positive feedback leads to something different in terms of the scaling phenomena. That is, instead of sublinear scaling, economy of scale, the bigger you are, the less per capita, it leads to the bigger you are, the more per capita, and at the same time to an increasing pace of life. And I want to show you data on that. And here is just a small sampling of data of half a dozen metrics in different cities, across different urban systems, across the globe. And you can see just by eye, they all scale in very similar ways, although they're very different things. There's patents and restaurants and crime, GDP, and so on, all very different things, but they're all hooked into and have the commonality of networks. And by the way, Sweden also follows it. I think you're that second dot where you're sitting is that second dot, red dot on that graph. So what is that in English? What those graphs say is that the good, bad, and the ugly all come together in a similar way because they're all derived from the same thing. And to put it all together in approximately, on average, if you double the size of a city within an urban system, then you save about 15% on all infrastructure, and at the same time, you gain 15% on all the good things, income, wealth, patents, colleges, and so on, but also all the bad things like crime and AIDS and flu and pandemics. All of that is derived from social networks. And just to show you that, here is a graph of social connectivity as a function of city size, which you can see follows again by eye that same 1.15, roughly speaking, slope. Look, confirming the idea that underlying this is the social interactions coming from within social networks. And one of the big questions, of course, that the pandemic has brought up is what happens when we relieve ourselves of the social network? I'm sorry, of the place, but we still keep social networks, which is what we're doing now in this kind of soulless, two-dimensional way of interacting via Zoom. What happens to these laws? And I think that's a fascinating question in general about what effect the internet is going to be having. I'm going to finish up with two things. I'm going to quickly go through growth. The way growth works for you, as well as for cities, as well as for companies, is there's something called metabolic rate, which is all the stuff that's driving the system. That gets a portion between maintenance, that is you repair what's broken and replace things that have disappeared, both infrastructure and people, and then you add new things, you add new infrastructure, you develop new things and new people. And what that leads to, if it were sublinear behavior, it leads to stopping of growth and sustainability. If you have superlinear behavior coming from the positive feedback in social networks, you get something that's called super exponential growth, which is wonderful because that's what we see. We've been growing faster than exponential. I'm not going to show you data. And unbounded growth. And that's great. So this fits very nicely, except it has a fatal consequence. And that fatal consequence is a finite time singularity, because what it says, to cut a very long story short, is if you keep going, you're destined to collapse. And the question is, how do you avoid collapse? And you avoid collapse by innovating or resetting the clock, reinventing yourself, making a major paradigm shift, making a major innovation, doing something to start all over again before you hit the singularity, and off you go again with a new life, so to speak, a new paradigm shift. You invent computers, you discover coal, whatever. It resets the clock, but you would hit another singularity. So there's kind of a theorem that if you demand open-ended, unbounded growth, then you must keep having these major innovations, probably both at the personal level as well as at the city level or company level. But the price you pay for that is not only does life get faster, but you have to do this faster and faster and faster at an almost predictable rate. And I don't have time to go through this. This is data. It's in great agreement with the data, and I've just written down here what I said. But the important thing is that this is part of the continuous accelerating pace of life, and that we are the same people that we were 100,000 or 1 million years ago, the same brains, the same biology, and our difficulties are becoming harder and harder to adapt to these huge changes. And the question is, any of this sustainable as times to new innovations get shorter and shorter? I will finish up very briefly with a few slides about companies. If you ask how the number of companies scales with city size, it's extraordinarily simple. Here's the United States. It's linear. And that linearity has some interesting numbers, which are slightly tangential to this talk. But it says each time you increase the population by about 20 people, you add a new business, which is sort of amazing. And you only need about 12 people for each business. Now, of course, there's huge variance in this. There's huge companies, and single-person companies. So it's a huge averaging. The other thing about these companies, the growth of this, is that they get more and more diverse, and the most successful cities are the most diverse, particularly in terms of jobs and business and so on, because it turns out GDP, you can show increases exponentially with increase of diversity. So do companies scale? The answer is yes, but in a slightly different way, because there's huge variance, because companies haven't been around very long. This is averaging over bins of companies, and what you see is scaling. But what is important here for this talk is that this is sublinear. It's not like cities. This is income and assets versus the number of employees. And this is sublinear. And here's actually the data. We looked at 30,000 US publicly traded companies, and there's huge variance, but all of the slopes are sublinear, which, if it's like, means it's like biology, superficially at least. It's like biology, which means you stop growing and then you die. So here's the data of all those 30,000 companies. It's a spaghetti graph, and you can see on the right all the new, young, vigorous companies, and all those old companies looking like me at the top, just sort of going along. And in fact, if you renormalize to the GDP, you remove the GDP, those ones at the top are just floating on top of the GDP. And of course, not much of a variation, a fluctuation of externalities means you lose a TWA, et cetera, et cetera. And the growth curve, this is a little unfair because this is about the best of all of them. Here's Walmart when in its early years looking like a hockey stick, and here it is in later years, and that is a prediction of the theory, that red line. And I'm going to finish up quickly with mortality. I'm sorry, this is a bit busy, but on the left is the probability of surviving. Maybe just look at that. And you can see this is the different colors represent different sizes of companies, but you can see all of the probability of survival goes to 0. And in fact, the age, the expected lifespan of a publicly traded company in the United States is about 10 years. Miss that out. I will end up with 2 quotes. One I'm sure you're very familiar with by the great economist Joseph Schumpeter. Creative destruction is the essential fact about capitalism. So it's not bad that any of that happens. But this one I really like. It's sort of more personal. All successful people are standing on ground that is crumbling beneath their feet. And like all of these statements given ascribed to men, a woman said it first. Destruction is the cause of coming into being by Sheva Spielbein, the great psychologist. But I do want to finish with a quote by John von Neumann, without whom we wouldn't be communicating this way, let alone using any of our IT. Namely, the ever accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs, as we know them, could not continue. And he said that in 1954. And so I think this is the big question, and the question how we deal with it. So with that, I thank you, and I think I went on too long.
Thank you very much, Geoffrey. This is a very fascinating and very rich talk, and we'll get into this a little bit more. Stay with us while I introduce 2 more people who have joined us here. We have here to discuss this further Robin Teigland, Professor of Strategy and Management of Digitalization at Chalmers Technical University, where I know you do research on many things, on businesses, digital innovation, circular economy, and about applying artificial intelligence to ocean data, just to mention a few things. And Charlotta Melander, professor in economics at Jönköping Business School, and a researcher on cities, creativity, and regional development. Welcome. So glad you could be here.
Thank you.
Charlotta, this approach that Geoffrey takes in his research and has been doing for some years now with the data and the math and the very quantitative study of cities, what has that meant to the science of cities largely?
Well, I would say that the work by Professor West has added science to urban science in a way it wasn't there before. Even though we have been talking about agglomeration effects and the advantage of growing for decades and even centuries, he showed the regularity of this in a way that we hadn't seen before.
That's fascinating. I know that one of the things that you have studied is what makes a city attractive. That's a centerpiece of your research. Now, I'm curious that a city continues to grow. Is that in itself a good measure of its attractiveness? That means that it's a good city? Or is that not necessarily the case?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good city for everyone. but it seems to be a good city for enough people to actually have an impact on the growth of the city and the quality of life in that city. Whenever we talk about, for example, Stockholm or Gothenburg being attractive cities, I always get back, but I don't want to live in those cities. And of course, we don't have the same preference structures. But it seems like when a place becomes attractive to many people, it starts growing because more people move in than what they move out. And then we get these kind of effects that we just heard Professor West talk about.
Right. Robin, part of your research is looking into how companies can support innovation and adapt to digitalization and change. And I know that Geoffrey's research seems to show that as companies, as he showed a little bit here, as companies grow big, they go stiff and then they die. So I think this begs two questions. First, do companies have to go big? And secondly, does it matter that they die?
Yeah. That's great. Excellent questions. It's about growing big. I don't think companies necessarily do have to grow big, but they're part of a bigger system where if we think about capitalism, we think about stock markets, et cetera, we think about quarterly returns, there is a lot of pressure on organizations from stakeholders, from shareholders to grow. We have to get increasing returns, increasing profit. So there is these external drivers to growth. But then again, what are a lot of like small family businesses as well, and who's to say that they don't have the same aspirations, necessarily all of them, to grow, to grow, to grow. So I think it's about a balance. It's interesting to see. And regards to the second question again was...
is it a problem that they die?
I think it's great that they die. And actually I wanted to ask Professor West about some type of correlation between the new S curve, right? And some type of pattern with the companies, the 30,000 companies that they've been looking at, in terms of what are we seeing right before it's like taking off again in terms of the companies and if they're a higher rate of death then or a higher rate of new companies being formed. And I think it's very good that companies die because as they grow, as they get stiff, you have innovation and resources that get stuck. Where does innovation come from? Well, it's about bridging boundaries between different networks. We saw that with diversity in the cities, for example. Innovation comes when people from different networks come together, and if you're within the same walls, the same knowledge goes round and round and round again, and you do all the things right, but are you doing the right things? Yeah. So as companies die, it releases resources for people to meet, say, in the plaza or at the fika, for example, and exchange ideas, and that's where the new ideas and new companies come from. And if we need to have this increasing pace, right, with which we need to enable sustainability, then I think we will probably be seeing we'll need an increasing rate potentially of these companies dying so that we can release innovation and make sure that we create those next S waves.
Right. Did you have a question for Geoffrey on this? You said that something that you might want to comment on?
Yeah, I was just kind of curious, this relationship between these 30,000 companies and some type of pattern, seeing kind of these waves in terms of what type of relationship there is between when that next wave comes and something related to, say, the death rate or the establishment rate or something related to the companies. If there was something that might predict that kind of next, wave.
Okay, what do you say?
So can you hear me? Am I?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
So we've been looking at some of these questions. I should say, those graphs on survivability and mortality that I showed very quickly at the end, what I didn't say is that they're almost pure exponentials. And I had a graph, the last graph I didn't show, showed the almost a perfect fit to an exponential, the only outliers being the ones that are very old. So in a certain sense, the probability of dying is independent of your size, which is a very curious notion. I mean, it's the same, in other words, the pattern of a decay of companies is almost exactly the same as the decay pattern of atoms that are radioactive. You know, it's just it's almost random who's going to die, which is extraordinary and quite surprising. But we have tried to ask the question. What we've tried to do most recently is try to find what would be the indicators
Right.
in terms of the fluctuations rather than, you know, where they sit sort of relative to these scaling phenomena. But what are the fluctuations around that scaling that would indicate over a period of time that this company is in serious trouble? So I don't want to talk about that now. It's very much work in progress. One of the problems that you could see with the data, there are huge variances here. So we're trying to be very careful in drawing strong conclusions. But the point I would like to make is that two things. First, the problem in trying to understand companies versus cities or organisms is that in cities and in organisms, we know what goes on inside us. I mean, you know, we know our physiology, and inside cities, we have lots of data about cities. But companies, the data is proprietary. We do not know what the networks are inside companies. It would be great to get the, you know, who's really talking to whom, who's really making the decisions, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, of course, not available, which limits the scope of this work. However, having said that, we've done a lot of narrative stuff. And the thing that seems pretty clear is the difference between cities and companies is the companies are so much more one-dimensional or unidimensional, low-dimensional, relative to cities. As I said, cities, as they grow, open up. They become more and more diverse, more transparent even. But companies tend to go the other way. I mean, they might start out with a large product space, for example, but quickly market forces limits them. And that pressure because of market forces becoming more and more less dimensional and therefore less diverse means they become more and more vulnerable. And the great thing about cities like ecosystems is that their diversity is what allows them to be sustainable. Yeah. So I'm sorry, I can't answer your question yet.
That's okay. I look forward to learning more later.
We'll get back to it some other time, I'm sure. I was thinking, now, Geoffrey, your work is a lot about this, about analyzing data and then finding a pattern and making a model. And this makes it possible to make some type of prognosis. But now if I turn to all of you, really all three of you, with the question, what does it matter? Like, if we can tell in theory what's going to happen when a city or a company scales, can we actually use that for something? And will we actually use that for something? Charlotta?
Well, to start with, I can come up with many ways to use this. I think for Sweden, for example, it's interesting because we have a limited number of population here, and we are competing on a global market. And if we can't really scale anything to the extent that you can scale in some other more populated nations, what will that do to our competitiveness on a global market? I think that is one way to look at this. And another thing that I find interesting is that I'm doing a lot of visits to regions around Sweden, and I hear a lot of smaller places saying, well, we don't really want to grow anymore, and we may even shrink, but that's fine because this is the way we want it. But that when we look at these results that are presented here, you can see that there's so many advantages with growing, which also means that there are disadvantages from not growing that they may not take into consideration by just sitting and feeling content the way it is, because you sort of lose in competitiveness compared to those that grow faster than you do.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not so sure, but that's why we're here, right? I work a lot too with thinking about the future and scenarios, and one thing that you learn is just because you see a line like this doesn't necessarily mean that it might continue. And you know, exactly the last picture we saw was this picture of virtual, and we're all can work in a virtual environment where we are able to share knowledge and even create things together as we move into a world of immersion, of immersive virtuality with 5G, et cetera. I've worked a lot in virtual worlds, and I think the ability to actually create things, come together, create those knowledge accidents online is growing. Look at open source software communities. Look at where Bitcoin came from. I mean, it came from a group of people working together over the internet. They were strangers, did not know one another. And today we have blockchain technology that resulted from that. So I think we haven't had this ability to bring our minds together to the same degree that we have today until just recently. And many of these things go a long way back, but now perhaps things might be different. Another thing I'm wondering about is companies we've had in terms of economies of scale have been very much on the supply side, where you grow, and you reduce your unit cost. Today we have large companies, Facebook, Google, et cetera, who have network effects, and the economies of scale are on the demand side. And so the question then is, will these companies continue this pattern as other previous companies have done in terms of these economies of scale on the supply side? And so we might see, yes, we're seeing regulation coming along potentially. So I think we don't know what will happen in the future. One thing that I think is really interesting to think about is these regions and saying we don't want to grow. And I think it's also, if we want to reduce pressure on cities, why not facilitate the growth of communities? Because now with technologies as they're emerging, you will have ability to have access to healthcare, to education, to food, to energy, regardless of where you are as new technologies emerge. So I do a lot of work on ocean and ocean communities, and this is one of the things we're working on, is creating circular economy models in coastal communities. So I think time will tell. We don't know yet. I mean, we have all these new technologies at our fingertips now.
Right. Do you think so too, Charlotte, that there might be a possibility that so far what you said about not growing, maybe not being socially sustainable, will that change?
I'm not so certain. and I think it partly has to do with that we are normally focusing on different units of analysis, right?
Yes.
You're looking at companies, I'm looking at cities, I'm looking at regions, and I think maybe the preconditions are a bit different depending on this, as we've just seen in the presentation too. So I think there are many disadvantages from not growing, especially in relation to those that actually do grow. And I think that is what we are experiencing right now in most parts of the Western world, that we see places that are almost left behind, that are now being very discontent, and we're seeing social effects from this and political effects from this. So it's sort of connected in so many ways that we may not even think about on a regular basis.
It's true.
Geoffrey, do you think, when you listen to this, do you think that this is even a choice we can make to grow or not grow? Is it possible to decide not to scale, being a city or being a company, or is that sort of out of our hands?
Yeah, first, before answering that, I thought your original question about, what, in a certain sense, what's the point of all this? Can it be useful? I think I did want to address that briefly, because I think it was really, in a sense, already answered in the sort of first introductory panel by all those people talking in praise of science, because the lesson that we have learned is that mechanistically understanding the way systems work and natural phenomena essentially always leads to new ideas, new ways of doing things, and has been the underlying driving force behind technologies, even though it may take sometimes 5, 20, or 50 years. Yeah. So I think it's crucial, and I think I cannot imagine that we'll ever come to terms with understanding cities, let alone the planet, without developing a much more quantitative, mechanistic framework for understanding the way the system works. So with that, let me segue briefly to the question of growth. And it's a dilemma. It's a huge dilemma, because first of all, we discovered this paradigm, with the beginning of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution, and the flowering of entrepreneurship, and that open-ended growth sort of ensured that standards and quality of life would continue to rise, and that's become sort of a mantra of finance and economics. And indeed, the data I showed sort of, in a certain sense, confirms that. But the dilemma is that built into that is its own collapse, and that's the issue we're facing. I mean, at the moment, and the way I see it is that the big issue, actually, I mean, the way people normally get out of it is they say, well, you shouldn't worry because we'll always innovate and science will provide the answer. And that, of course, has been true. But the point is, what I would say is that innovations don't solve the problem. They simply postpone the problem. And we're going to have to deal with it because the times that we have to deal with it are getting shorter and shorter. And that is the price we pay of demanding open-ended growth. So I think what we'd have to do is, first of all, change the idea of what we mean by an innovation, that an innovation doesn't necessarily mean a technological innovation. It needs to be maybe a cultural or political innovation. And already people are thinking about that. Also, I think we need maybe even to redefine growth. Maybe the idea of growth needs to be sort of reassessed. So I think there's lots of open-ended issues. And while I completely agree with Charlotta that obviously, because that's what the data shows, that success in the sense of, you know, more wealth per person, more ideas per person, increase as you grow, you could ask the question, which I guess is implicit in this, is it conceivable to have a static situation and yet have a sort of a standard of living that you can maintain and quality of life that you can maintain without that growth, which has been associated with the stimulations of new ideas. So, you know, it's hard to see how to unpack those and disconnect them without something fundamental changing in terms of social interaction, social network, meaning in our culture. So it's you know, it's total, obviously this is speculative, but it's hard to see a way out of this, frankly. That is something that, you know, one can be prescriptive about.
We are running out of time here, so I have to be satisfied with one last question, even though I would really like to continue this discussion for much longer. And what I'm thinking about is that from the looks of it, we're going to continue having cities and bigger cities and more cities for a long time to come. And they can turn into, possibly they can turn into some sort of sustainability catalysts, considering the scaling effects of the sublinearity in what the cities need. But they can for sure also turn into sustainability catastrophes. So I'd like to hear you all say something about what science can do to drive this in the right direction, and how you feel your chances are to get out as scientists and actually make a difference. Are you listened to? Are you actually able to affect policy making? So, do you want to start, Robin?
Yes.
Something brief on this. And
yeah,
then
no, I think that's a
Geoffrey.
fascinating, very interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I think about in terms of growth in cities, et cetera, is why if people move to the cities, it's because that's where the jobs were. And the question is now, to what degree will jobs be there in the future? The more we automate, the more we use AI, et cetera. So the question is, will there be that many jobs that will continue to attract people? So perhaps the jobs will be back in smaller communities. So maybe this aspect of growth, or what is growth and what is innovation, potentially maybe we'll be going back to social innovation or cultural innovation, where we return perhaps to the communities that we had in the 1600s or 1700s, prior to the, say, the Industrial Revolution. So that's, you know, it's again, we don't know clearly what will happen in the future, but I think in terms of getting out and making a difference, yes, definitely in terms of I find that it's very much listened to, asked to write a lot of reports, but I think it's also up to us to actually get out there and do things. Right. So I've started a company in Portugal, Ocean Tech Hub, where we're working with using these new technologies to create a circular economy, using graphene, for example, this new material, 3D printing, all of these to actually facilitate rejuvenating a coastal community by figuring out how can we fish more sustainably, for example, how can we reuse ocean litter for something new? How can
trying to make a very hands-on change.
Yes, very much so.
That's really
But at the same time, spreading and inspiring and showing others that it is possible to get out there and do things. And
of course. Yes. Charlotta.
So I don't think there's ever been a better time to talk about cities. I think people in general are very interested in cities nowadays, compared to when I wrote my dissertation a couple of decades ago. No one really talked about cities in Sweden the same way that we do today. And it is partly true that people are moving to cities because of the jobs, but there is also this value of being close to other people. which is a quality of life sort of related factor that you get by moving to cities. And I think that part will be very hard to get away from, even though the pandemic is challenging that side right now. I think once we're out of this, I think that sort of human behavior and human need will still be there. And I still think that people will be drawn to cities because of this.
Thank you. And Geoffrey, what can be done, and can your data and what you're doing affect this?
Well, first I want to echo what Carlotta said. I think, I sort of put it in more bold terms, maybe, that I think that I speculate that urban living is almost become part of our social DNA. People are attracted to cities partly because of jobs, but overwhelmingly, I think because also they want to have that social connection in physical space. And I think we're going to run into all kinds of interesting questions because of the move, which was already in place before the pandemic, of moving to interactions, me interacting with you this way. Obviously, there'll be more and more, much more of it, but what that will do is unknown. But I think that it will not stop people moving to cities. I think there may be a small hiatus, but ultimately cities generically will keep growing because it's sort of built into who we are now. So now the question of whether this is a question I ask myself all the time. I got into this thinking that no one was interested in cities, and there weren't many people there were obviously urban science, urban geography and planning, but I thought it was sort of a backwater, but it turns out that in the intervening time, cities people have been recognized as becoming more and more important. And indeed, because of that, I do talk a great deal to both cities themselves, but more so even to events put on by, international events where mayors attend and practitioners and administrators and so forth. And I get a tremendous response. And that's very pleasing and good for my ego, but I'm not sure, frankly, that I'm having any real effect. I think people, the immediate problems are so powerful and so big in most cities that people find themselves, despite being intrigued and wanting to get involved with this kind of thing, that they've got to solve the problem, and mayors and so on, politicians, 1 to 2 years is infinity. Whereas these issues and the kinds of things I'm thinking about and have been discussed here are sort of 10, 20, 50-year problems, and there isn't much time left. So yes, I do get involved. I'm disappointed that, frankly, that despite the best efforts and the many, many talks and interactions I have, I'm not convinced that I'm having very much impact, which is a shame. There are things, I could point out, maybe I'm being a bit negative today because there are lots of things where cities have acted on what I've done. In fact, Singapore, I will say one thing, Singapore changed a lot of its policies based on some of this work. So I guess that's a big impact.
I'm sure it is.
Mostly not.
However, it seems that you do have an impact on science, that your science has an impact on science. And probably part of science work is to take this big picture and not look at 1 year or 2 years, right? But 10 or 20 or more than that. So I would like to say thank you so much. Thanks, Geoffrey West, for taking part here tonight. And thank you to Robin Tegland and Charlotta Melander for being here. This has been a great time and a great discussion. And I thank all of you who watched and listened, and I wish you all a great evening and a wonderful rest of the festival. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.